The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And each week, Beth and I delve into stories that piqued our curiosity. But first, we have an update on a past episode. So, Beth, why don't you start it off?
Okay. So, Eduardo, the ghost, is a newlywed.
Yay!
He got married just this past Halloween.
For those of you who remember our ghost marriage episode, I believe it was episode 12. I talked about a woman who dates ghosts. And Eduardo is a ghost who is a Victorian-era soldier. And at the time of the previous episode, there was a singer in the UK who claimed she was dating him and engaged to him.
They got married. But I guess Eduardo was up to his usual bad behavior.
Oh, not again.
Yes, on the honeymoon, he apparently didn't want to share his new wife's ice cream while they were on the beach, and he knocked her over and got her ice cream all sandy.
Oh, why, Eduardo? Well, that's not very gentlemanlike of him. Not a good way to start off the honeymoon.
No, and he also stayed up all night, drinking all the liquor out of the mini fridge in the honeymoon suite. Because
no way.
Because when his wife woke up in the morning, she was surrounded by empty mini bottles, and she hadn't been drinking, so
he's a ghost drinking liquor.
Spirits, if you will.
Right. So I don't get how he holds it. Is there a puddle on the floor after he gets done drinking? Yeah, it really seems like he's up to his usual tricks.
Apparently.
Well, for what it's worth, we wish the newlyweds the best of luck. I'm sure we will have more updates on the couple's marriage to share with everyone in the near future.
I'm sure we will. So, where did your mind wander for this episode?
I have a rather fascinating story about some strange happenings that occurred in the Vietnam jungle. So sit back, get comfy, and let's get into it. Quang Nam Province, Vietnam Hill, 868 and 1966. Imagine, if you will, a unit of Marines hunkered down in the dense, humid jungle of Vietnam, awaiting orders from command. A decade into the conflict, the combat-hardened Marines knew what to expect. The Marines stayed eerily still, keeping their eyes focused on the trees around them. The rustling of trees or the tiniest noticeable movement, and they could suddenly be surrounded by enemy fighters. Predictably, but unnervingly, trees on all sides of the Marine company began to shake, but not with a slight movement as they've come to expect. This time, the trees shake violently. Tense under the imminent threat of ambush, the Marines raised their rifles, taking aim, scanning the tangled foliage for the first glimpse of clothing or a face of the enemy, their ears straining to hear any telltale sign that they are about to engage in a firefight. One of the Marines radioed command, reporting that they expected to engage in enemy fire. To their surprise, what first peers out at them and then steps out behind the trees has them completely in shock. Surrounding them on all sides are what they can only assume are giant orangutans.
In Vietnam?
Yes. Each one of the creatures stands on 2 feet and are between 5 and 6 feet tall. Covered in bright orange hair from head to toe, they stare from deep-set, dark brown eyes. Their stomachs protrude from their stout, otherwise muscular bodies. But unlike orangutans, these creatures have 5-inch long fangs.
Oh, that's not an orangutan.
Completely unsure what to do, the Marines radioed command again, asking for orders. Afraid of giving away their position by firing on them, the commanding officer tells the soldiers to throw some rocks at them to scare them off. So hoping to scare off these bipedal fanged monkeys or apes or orangutans or whatever they are, the Marines do just that, lobbing rocks at the half-dozen creatures they can see. But rather than taking off running, these Bigfoot-like creatures pick up even bigger rocks and throw them right back with incredible accuracy. The CO orders the soldiers to remain quiet and use their bayonets on them. Then, what the commanding officer reportedly hears over the radio next is horrifying. First, hollering, then yelling, as if an epic battle is taking place between the handful of soldiers and hundreds of these creatures. When this battle is finally over, injured Marines and several of the creatures, including the babies, are strewn across the area. Although there are no deaths, thankfully, there is blood everywhere. The Rock Apes of Vietnam had struck again.
Wow.
And the account I just told you is reportedly very true.
Double wow.
Although orangutans were known to have existed in the jungles of Vietnam at one time, they were completely wiped out and considered extinct for 1,000 years before 1955, when the conflict began. But the Vietnamese people spoke about the rock apes, which were called that because they were known to have deadly aim with rocks and be able to lift 200 to 300-pound boulders and throw them at anyone who invaded their territory for decades before American forces entered their jungles. They called them Batut-tuts, or jungle people, and couldn't explain exactly what they were either, but that they lived in large social groups and were most commonly spotted at dawn or dusk, and that they should be totally avoided. The battle on Hill 868 was not an isolated incident. In fact, there were hundreds of eyewitness accounts. Soldiers from all over the country were returning home to the States with strange tales about the rock apes that ranged from the merely unexplainable to the downright frightening. Sightings were so common, actually, that soldiers said they would be walking along and end up not a foot or two away from one of the creatures hunkered down in the jungle. Many accounts described them as having bright orange hair, although just as many said that their hair or fur was black or brown. The rock apes' faces were hairless, though, and they all had deep, dark brown eyes. They stood anywhere from 5 to 6 feet tall and were almost always standing on 2 feet. They also had those 5-inch fangs protruding out of their mouths.
They sound terrifying.
That they do. In most cases, if it was a single rock ape, the soldiers could just continue on their way with no confrontation. The creature would just either stay frozen in place or it would take off without harming anyone. One account goes that 6 men from the 101st Airborne Division were hunkered down in the jungle, exactly like the Marines on Hill 868. When about 15 yards uphill from them, the trees began to shake violently. As they also took aim, they all saw a reddish, hairy creature emerge from the brush. It had a huge mouth and dark, deep-set eyes. As the humans and the creature stared at each other, sizing each other up, the soldiers began arguing over whether or not it was an orangutan. During their debate, the lone rock ape simply turned around and disappeared into the thick, dense vegetation of the jungle. But in the cases where the rock apes were in groups and felt threatened, the encounters quickly turned aggressive and violent. For example, another eyewitness claimed that during a nighttime patrol, an entire platoon noticed what looked like a large ball rolling towards them through a ravine. It stopped so close to them that one soldier tapped it with the end of his rifle. The thing suddenly unrolled itself, coming to stand on 2 feet, emitting screams and waving its long arms around.
Like tribbles on steroids. You know, like the trouble with tribbles on Star Trek? That's just what it made me think of.
Yeah, now that's a dated reference.
Sorry, we'll say it's like Furbies on steroids for the younger set.
Okay, so let's get back to it. At the moment the small rock ape started screaming, 300 to 400-pound boulders came crashing down into the ravine from higher above. Convinced that the soldiers had accidentally threatened a baby rock ape and the large group of adults were now on the attack, the soldiers kept moving, only to have 20 or more of the 6-foot-tall fanged creatures come running at them. Fearing for their lives, the platoon opened fire, killing 17 of them.
Wow.
However, the killing of the cryptids was never confirmed by the U.S. military.
Of course it wasn't.
One specific hill in Vietnam had so many reported sightings that it was nicknamed Monkey Mountain. So, what exactly were these soldiers seeing? The first obvious answer is that they really were orangutans. But like I said, there were no known orangutans still existing in Vietnam. They had basically become extinct 1,000 years before. Plus, orangutans prefer to be solitary creatures and don't normally travel in packs. They also don't walk upright for prolonged periods of time, and most importantly, they don't have 5-inch fangs.
Right?
To be fair, there are a couple of other primate contenders that soldiers may have been misidentifying. At least that's what some skeptics propose. Gibbons are native to Vietnam. They do live in large social groups, but gibbons are much, much smaller primates. Since so many eyewitness accounts were from very close encounters, it seems unlikely that gibbons were the real culprit here. Another possible primate suspect is the Tonkin snub-nosed monkey, but they only grow to an average of 1.9 feet tall, so it's unlikely that they would be the culprits either.
Those Tonkin snub-nosed monkey things are really strange looking. Like they're just weird looking. So I don't think they sound like what they were describing at all.
It has also been suggested that the soldiers were either hallucinating from LSD or PTSD. Okay, to me, that sounds pretty disingenuous. Granted, the situations they were in were beyond stressful and unbelievably horrific, but implying that hundreds of soldiers all across Vietnam were hallucinating from either drugs or stress just seems ridiculous to me.
And rude.
And it wasn't just American soldiers who were reporting encounters with the rock apes. In fact, so many Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers reported sightings that an expedition to capture or kill one was carried out in 1974 by the Vietnam People's Army. Up to that point, no rock ape bodies were ever recovered, and there were only a handful of blurry photographs. The expedition came back empty-handed.
Aw.
2 other expeditions, led by 2 different universities, had also tried to prove the existence of the rock ape. The first one in 1970 was led by Dr. John McKinnon, who said he found tracks that locals claimed were from the Batut. The tracks had human-looking toes, but were the size of an Asiatic black bear. Asiatic black bears aren't native to Vietnam either. The 1974 Hanoi University expedition also found some humanoid footprints that they were able to cast and have examined. The results came back that they were not human, but were otherwise inconclusive.
That's really interesting. I mean, you would think all these soldiers that are coming back and all the different things that they witnessed and that they lived through, the last thing they're going to do is make up stories about Bigfoot in the Vietnam jungle.
I agree.
So they were seeing something, and it sounds like they were pretty aggressive.
That it does, and I believe what they're saying, and the Vietnamese people.
Right, because it wasn't just the soldiers, it was the local people too.
Yeah, there's definitely something to this story, but it's one of those things. I've never spoken to any of my relatives that were in Vietnam to ask them if they had ever heard of these creatures. But it's usually not something you really bring up to them anyway.
Right.
They don't care to talk about
and
time.
Who can blame them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, did you know? Alcohol consumption is not allowed at West Point. All because of one riot back in 1826 involving what drink? Eggnog. Colonel Sylvanus Thayer laid down the law after witnessing cadets carrying a commanding officer on their shoulders and then performing a snake dance on July 4th. Thayer decreed that no alcohol was allowed from there on out. The cadets, however, had other plans. As Christmas rolled around, the cadets rolled in smuggled barrels of rum and whiskey and possibly even brandy and wine. They were quiet as mice on Christmas, for a bit. But roused from his sleep at 4 a.m., Commanding Officer Ethan Allen Hitchcock was quick to find 13 very sloshed cadets in Room 5 of the North Barracks. Cadet Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, a little too tipsy himself, rushed into Room 5 shouting to watch out that Hitchcock was on his way. Imagine his surprise to find himself shouting at Hitchcock himself. Hitchcock literally read the Riot Act to the 13 cadets. The Riot Act stated that no more than 11 men could assemble in one room at any given time. The boisterous 13 said heck no and resisted. Commanding Officer William A. Thornton didn't fare so well upon his investigation of the South Barracks either. The revelers inadvertently knocked him unconscious. 1/3 of West Point's cadets took part in the eggnog party, smashing furniture, breaking windows, and ripping banisters from the stairs. But what could Colonel Thayer do? He couldn't expel 1/3 of the cadets. All in all, 19 cadets were court-martialed, 11 faced expulsion, and 6 cadets resigned. During the trials, 167 witnesses testified, including Robert E. Lee. Lee testified in defense of several classmates. New barracks replaced the old in the 1840s, making it impossible to access other floors from the interior. All because of some eggnog. Who'da thunk it?
So, Beth, where did your mind wander for this episode?
Well, I'm super excited about my topic tonight because it's my favorite kind of story, and I just find it maddeningly interesting. But first, I have a question for you. What unsolved mystery really intrigues you?
Well, that's a really tough one for me because there's quite a few to list. I'm really fascinated by David Paulides. He does the Missing 411 series. He has the films and books, and he covers all the disappearances that have happened in national parks and forests across the United States and elsewhere over the last several decades. And he's also dabbling into other countries now. So I would say that his mysteries I find pretty fascinating.
Yeah, his Missing 411 cases.
Yeah.
They're really interesting.
They really are. But what about you?
Well, for me, there are two. The whole who was D.B. Cooper thing is pretty interesting to me. And the second one is the Dyatlov Pass Incident. And I don't know why the Dyatlov Pass Incident fascinates me so deeply, but it has for years. So I decided that tonight I'm going to talk about it.
Yeah, we've watched quite a bit on the Dyatlov Pass.
I know, and it sends me
mystery.
down the rabbit hole every single time. So if you've never heard of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, you are in for a maddening down the rabbit hole treat. And if you have heard about it, there is a relatively new breakthrough that I'm excited to share at the end. In late January of 1959, 10 very experienced winter hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a journey. Packed with everything they needed for an extended overnight winter camping trip, the former students, most in their 20s, Igor Dyatlov, for whom the incident is named, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Georgy Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolovadov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, Yuri Yurdin, and 38-year-old Alexander Zolotarov were in great spirits and excited for their 12-day adventure.
I don't know how you get through those names.
Well, I don't think I got through them very well,
Well,
but I did it.
Much better than I would have. I would have butchered the heck out of them.
I'm sure I did.
Okay, carry on.
They planned to hike through a pass, camp on the other side, and then hike back the way they'd come. On their way to their starting point, however, Yuri Yudin became ill and he backed out. He left the party before they started their hike and returned home. Although it was considered a rather difficult hike and was being undertaken at the most difficult time of year, their route was sanctioned and approved, so they had dotted their I's and crossed their T's. On January 31st, the group of 9 left surplus food and equipment at the entrance to the pass that they planned to hike, implying that they certainly expected to make it back to where they'd started. Then they headed into the snow-packed pass. Most experts agree that they must have planned to hike through the pass and set up camp on the other side, but the weather didn't cooperate. Blowing snow lessened the visibility, and the group lost their direction and deviated west. When they realized they were off course, they decided to set up camp on the slope of a mountain. The group kept several journals, one communal one and several personal ones. Ludmilla, the youngest, was a track star, cross-country skier and economics major. Georgie worked at the then-secret and nearby Mayak nuclear complex as an engineer. He was a likable guy who joked around and played the mandolin. Igor Dyatlov, who had put together the expedition, had led many expeditions before, and he had even invented his own outdoor equipment. Of the entire group, only 38-year-old Alexander Zolotarov seemed out of place. He had served in World War II and was added to their group by the UPI. So here's what we do know happened sometime between February 1st and 2nd. The 9 hikers did set up camp, but not where they'd originally planned. They built a snow wall to shelter their tent and hunkered down to wait out the storm. They took photographs and wrote in their journals. Igor Dyatlov had said that he would send word via telegram on February 12th that they had left the pass and arrived in the town of Vizhai. When February 12th came and went, and there was no word from the group, no one worried at first. It wasn't uncommon for these types of hiking expeditions to take longer than expected. But when February 20th arrived with still no word, the hikers' concerned families contacted the UPI demanding they send out a rescue party, which they did. The first rescue teams were volunteer teachers and students. Then the police and army forces became involved, using planes and helicopters. Even prison guards from the nearby Ivdel camp helped out, as well as Mansi hunters. Mansi are indigenous people living in that area. What they found was both horrifying and mystifying. Their tent was discovered empty of human life and half buried in the snow. Inside were ski boots, axes, and other equipment, neatly arranged on either side of the tent entrance. Food was set out as if a meal was just about to be shared. Wood was stacked for the heating stove. The hikers' clothes, cameras, and journals were all in their places. But even more strange, the tent had been slashed in several places, from the inside. Searchers spread out, and about 100 feet downhill, they came across distinct footprints of 8 or 9 people. The footprints indicated that the people who made them were walking. The fact that they were walking is pretty important later, and they had done it in just their socks, or in some cases, completely barefoot. The prints led to the tree line and disappeared. The following morning, the bodies of Georgy Krivanashenko and Yuri Doroshenko were discovered. They lay under a tall cedar tree at the edge of the forest, next to remnants of a fire. Both men were in just their underwear. I find these next details really creepy and kind of disturbing. But 15 feet above their heads, some of the tree's branches were broken, and around the trunk of the tree were scraps of shredded clothing and bits of human skin. Georgie had third-degree burns on one shin and foot. His fingers were black on one hand, and a chunk of his right hand was found inside his mouth. Yuri's hair was burned off from one side of his head, and one of his socks was charred. Remember, they're out in the middle of feet and feet of snow.
That they were.
Later that same day, Igor Dyatlov and Zenaida were found. They were further up the slope, both facing the direction of the abandoned tent. Oddly, both of them were found with their fists clenched tightly. A few days after that, Rustem Slobodin was found on the same slope. He was wearing only one sock. His cause of death was a skull fracture. So, 5 of the hikers had been found, but 4 were still missing. It wasn't until the snow began to melt in May that the remaining 4 were discovered. 250 feet from the cedar tree, a makeshift snow den was found, with pieces of tattered clothing strewn around it. When the search team used avalanche probes, they discovered a body, and then the 4 remaining hikers were found under 10 feet of snow, all lying close together. Their injuries were just as horrific as the others. Ludmila's chest was crushed, and the right ventricle of her heart had hemorrhaged. Her eyes were missing, as well as her tongue and part of her upper lip. Alexander Zolotarov's eyes were also missing, and several of his ribs were broken. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had a terribly fractured skull, and yet none of them had outwardly visible wounds. What they all did have in common was high levels of radiation in their bodies. What could have possibly done all that to them? Initially, the police thought murder, either by a member of the group or by an escaped convict from the nearby prison. But why? And how would 9 athletic 20-somethings not be able to fight off one escaped convict? Or what if one of the 9 had suddenly turned on the rest of them? It wouldn't explain their injuries, and it definitely doesn't explain the radiation.
No, their injuries were very peculiar.
I mean, with their eyes missing and just nasty stuff. Others proposed that something more supernatural may have occurred. One of the last photographs taken by Georgie shows strange light streaks across a black background. Perhaps aliens or Bigfoot had attacked them. Laugh if you want, but Bigfoot would explain why they left their tent in such a panic, cutting themselves out from the inside, and why none of them took the time to even put on boots, and it would explain their injuries. But not that radiation, and not why they all seem to be walking away from the tent instead of running. And skeptics claim that a photograph with strange light anomalies is common at the end of a roll of film. I don't know if that's true or not, but it could be. So what about weapons? It's been suggested that some sort of radiation rays may have been used as part of a test by the Russian military, and that the hikers were accidentally caught in the testing site. Remember, they had veered off course. It would explain why they left their tents, why they had radiation in their systems, and the strange light streaks in that one photograph. Apparently, another group of hikers saw orange glowing orbs in the northern sky from their camp just 31 miles from where the Dyatlov group died. But then, does that necessarily explain the horrific injuries they had? So what about the most obvious theory, that an avalanche woke them in the middle of the night and they fled to escape it? Despite there not being any evidence of an avalanche at all at their campsite, several experts now strongly believe that it might be what happened. There are 2 photographs from the night the group pitched their tent in the pass that show that the group cut into the snowpack at deep right angles to create a wind shelter for their tent. It's possible that in the middle of the night, part of that snow shelf collapsed onto the tent, injuring some of the hikers. Fearing that a full-scale avalanche was imminent, they may have abandoned the tent as quickly as possible, dragging their injured friends with them. If it was snowing, they may have become lost and ended up in different parts of the pass. Perhaps, except if that was what happened, what caused the burns on some of their bodies? What caused that darn radiation? And what caused 2 of them not to have eyeballs? The most common cause of death in an avalanche situation is asphyxiation, which was not the official cause of death for any of them. So what was? 6 of the hikers' official cause of death was hypothermia. Ludmila had severe internal bleeding from chest trauma, as did Alexander Zolotarov. Nikolai's official cause of death was a severe skull fracture, which is interesting. Remember, Ludmila, Alexander, and Nikolai were all found together, and they were the only ones whose causes of death wasn't hypothermia. So did they pass away first? Did the other members of the group put them side by side and then attempt to make it back to their camp before perishing? But did I mention that Ludmila was found wearing Georgie's pants, which were burned and torn? We could go around and around and around. And each time another article is published or another documentary is released, I watch it, fascinated and completely sucked in by the mystery of it all. Each time I hope against hope that this time there will be an answer, that there will be irrefutable proof that finally puts this mystery to rest. But I'm always left with questions, with the, well, what about this is? It saddens me and scares me that this group of young people experienced something so horrific. And I'm just glad that there are smarter people than me out there who haven't forgotten and are still looking for answers.
You know, I've read and watched quite a bit about the Dyatlov Pass, and I have a lot of feelings and theories about what might have happened, but that would take hours and hours to get into. I think you covered it pretty well in the short time that you had for your story.
And, well, thank you. And you're right. There is so much that you can look into. And, of course, all of our sources are in our show notes, and you can check them out. Some of them will give you hours and hours of reading, but you may end up with just as many questions in the end as I still have.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that'll be the case. Well, Beth, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode.
I would say that about does it.
We'll see you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment. It really helps us move up the list so people can find us.
See you next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.